All right, so today we're diving into a concept that I think really pushes against, well, against the entire culture of modern achievement.
It absolutely does.
We're talking about leadership, but there's this paradox right at its core. I mean, if you are leading anything, a business, a ministry, a small team, even just, trying to navigate your own life, you get it. You feel that intense pressure to be in control,
Hmm.
to have the answers, to be certain, independent. The whole world is basically telling us that real authority comes from gripping things tighter.
Right.
But the material we've been looking at asks this almost impossible question. What if the most powerful, the most strategic thing a leader can do is just let go?
Mm.
What if real influence comes from a posture of surrender?
And that is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We're unpacking material that just completely challenges that deep-seated cultural assumption of self-reliance.
Yeah.
The argument over and over is that true, sustainable, really transformative authority doesn't come from seizing control. It comes from releasing it to God's authority.
That is a huge paradigm shift.
It is. And the core finding we've distilled from all this is that surrender is never weakness. It's alignment. And that shift in your spiritual positioning, it reframes everything. Leadership stops being this crushing personal burden.
And it becomes a calling.
It becomes a spirit-led calling that's carried by grace, not by your own willpower.
Okay, let's start right there with that tension.
Yeah,
Because we all feel that instinct, to grip tighter.
we do. And the material highlights the subtle danger in just relying on sheer willpower.
What happens when we do that?
Well, when a leader depends only on their own finite strength, they just inevitably hit a wall. It might look like micromanagement or overextending themselves or just constant frantic decision-making.
Right, yeah.
But relying only on yourself, it ultimately clouds your judgment and leads straight to burnout. It's an unsustainable model. It denies our own humanity, our limits.
Okay, so we've been trained to see surrender as, like, giving up, waving the white flag. So we have to be really clear about what we mean by it
Yeah.
in this context.
Yeah, the definition is absolutely key here. Surrender, in this sense, is a strategic and a spiritual act. It's about yielding not just your plans, but your very identity and purpose to divine authority.
It's a transference.
It's an act of spiritual transference, and this is crucial. It is not an abdication of responsibility. You don't just quit. You don't stop working or planning.
You just reposition yourself.
Exactly. You become a steward, not the ultimate owner of the outcome.
So it's not passive at all. It's a proactive choice to be dependent.
Precisely. It's the moment the responsibility for the outcome shifts from your shoulders to God's.
Okay.
And the material lays out this really clear foundational framework for this. It goes, surrender leads to guidance, which leads to influence, which then leads to impact.
Surrender, guidance, influence, impact.
Every effective step of leadership, the sources argue, has to start with that first act of surrender.
That's fascinating. You move from trying to force outcomes to receiving guidance. So if you're listening and you feel that weight of the world on your shoulders right now, just consider that pressure. What might you be forfeiting, in terms of your own rest or clarity or just effectiveness by insisting on doing it all yourself in a world built on self-reliance? Now, I get that framework conceptually, but when you look at history, and especially the scriptural accounts you pulled from, they show this pattern where a leader has to be weakened before they're empowered. That just feels, I don't know, strategically risky.
It does.
How is letting go of control strategically wise? Doesn't that just invite chaos into, say, a complex organization?
That is the essential challenge, isn't it? But what the material shows is that divine strategies often begin right where human strategies run out of road.
Okay.
Let's trace this. Take Moses. He didn't become a leader as the Prince of Egypt, with all the status and military training.
Right, with all the advantages.
His leadership was formed with empty hands, as a shepherd, alone in Midian. He was completely stripped of the influence and the certainty that our world values so much.
So the confrontation at the burning bush.
That was God initiating leadership through a mandate of surrender. It wasn't some pep talk about Moses's hidden potential.
And what did he actually surrender there?
Everything. I mean, everything. He surrendered his identity, asking, who am I? He surrendered his certainty, asking, what am I supposed to say? And he surrendered his ability, saying, I am not eloquent. He was basically trying to resign before he even started.
And God's response is so powerful because it just sidesteps his resume completely. It wasn't, don't worry, you're capable.
No, not at all. It was, I will be with you. That's it. The entire foundation of his authority was divine presence, not personal competence.
Companionship, not charisma.
Exactly. And the sources point to the paradox of the staff. In Moses' hand, it's just a stick. It's totally insufficient. But when that common tool is yielded to God's hands,
It becomes
it
supernatural.
becomes a symbol of God's delegated authority. That's the essence of the transference we're talking about.
Which brings us to Paul, or Saul of Tarsus. He's kind of the opposite of Moses in the wilderness, right?
Yeah.
Saul was this ultimate high-capacity leader. Driven, zealous, brilliant.
Absolutely confident in his mission.
He had all the right human strengths, but his zeal, without surrender, it just led to destruction.
And his life really shows what happens when a leader puts their own passion and confidence above divine guidance. That Damascus Road experience, it wasn't just a conversion. The material calls it a divine interruption, a surgery.
A surgery, that's a good word for it.
Everything that defined him just collapsed. His vision, his confidence, his mission, his self-made authority. God had to cut away the leader Saul had built himself into so he could form the surrendered Apostle Paul.
And right there, in that moment of total helplessness, he asks the single most important question for any leader on this path.
Lord, what do you want me to do? That sentence. That's the cornerstone. It marks that total shift from self-will and personal ambition to divine purpose. If you ever find yourself in a leadership crisis, starting with that question re-anchors everything.
And of course, the perfect model is Jesus in Gethsemane, with that deepest form of yielding. Not my will, but yours be done. That connects to the theological idea of kenosis, or self-emptying. But, for a listener who doesn't track with that term, what does kenosis actually look like in a boardroom meeting?
That's a great question. Kenosis in leadership, practically speaking, means voluntarily releasing your right to be right.
Ooh, that's tough.
It is. It looks like truly giving credit to a subordinate when it's due. It looks like taking a hard but morally necessary path, even if it costs you popularity. It's the leader setting aside their ego so the organization's real surrendered purpose can be fulfilled.
So real power goes to those who yield their ego, not those who grab the spotlight.
In this framework, absolutely.
I can imagine a lot of listeners are nodding along with the biblical truth here, but what's the single biggest practical thing that stops leaders today from making that shift? Because it just feels like weakness.
I think the biggest barrier is the subtle pride that's all wrapped up in that phrase. The myth that authority requires self-reliance. When self-reliance becomes an idol, the leader feels like they have to take all the credit for success and shoulder all the blame for failure.
It's exhausting.
It's completely exhausting. And that form of pride, it leads directly to the kind of collapse we see in someone like King Saul. He failed because he kept substituting his own judgment for God's clear commands.
He was trying to manage the process.
Instead of submitting to the authority, his failure wasn't a lack of competence, it was a failure of submission.
So to be clear, surrender isn't about being weak. It's about strategically transferring control. Can you walk us through that transference again, practically?
Sure. It's shifting your dependence from human wisdom to divine wisdom, from your personal ambition to a divine purpose, and maybe most importantly, from fear-based leadership.
The what if I fail question.
Exactly. From that to spirit-led obedience, which just asks, okay, what am I being asked to do next?
Can we ground this in a non-scriptural example, someone from history who really embodies this?
I think William Wilberforce is a perfect example. His entire career was an exercise in surrendered leadership.
Yeah.
Here's this influential politician who could have easily chosen convenience, popularity, safety.
Easy path.
The easy path. Instead, he surrendered all of those advantages for one profound moral conviction, ending the British slave trade.
And that was not a quick fight.
Not at all. It was a long, brutal fight. He had to endure loss after loss, public ridicule. His opponents were incredibly powerful, entrenched interests. The authority he had, the credibility that let him eventually succeed, it didn't come from being a better political maneuverer.
Where did it come from?
It came from the unshakable moral gravity of his surrendered life. Because his identity was rooted in God, not in the House of Commons, he could keep fighting for decades without burning out or compromising. He became God's instrument because he had already yielded himself to God.
That makes so much sense. So the inner work is really about changing the energy that drives you as a leader. The material talks about surrendered leaders stopping performance and starting to listen.
Right. Performance is a treadmill. It's driven by this constant need to prove you're competent, to maintain this image of confidence, which, ironically, is often masking deep insecurity.
Mm.
Surrender just replaces that draining performance cycle with this incredible freedom.
Hmm.
When you truly believe God owns the outcome, you stop trying to control every single variable. You can actually start listening to God, to your team, to the environment, because you're no longer trying to force the solution yourself.
And this isn't some, mystical, abstract thing. This actually makes us better managers, better leaders on a Monday morning.
Absolutely. The practicality of surrender is so often overlooked. Think about Nehemiah. He was surrendered, fasting, praying, yes. But he wasn't sitting around waiting for the walls of Jerusalem to magically build themselves.
He had a plan.
He had a detailed plan. He was surveying the rubble, mobilizing people, creating a defense strategy. Surrender is proactive alignment. It means every practical decision you make, from a budget to a new hire, becomes an extension of your obedience and trust.
It links your daily calendar back to your ultimate spiritual purpose.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, let's pivot to the tangible results. What does this posture unlock in the workplace for the leader who's always felt like they had to be the hero?
The material is so consistent on this. Surrender generates this tremendous non-anxious courage.
Why? What's the source of that courage?
It's because the leader's foundation completely shifts. It moves from their personal skill to God's ultimate authority. And that freedom is what changes the day-to-day experience of leadership.
Let's talk about the specific fears that this dissolves. There were 3.
Right. First, it liberates you from the fear of failure. If God owns the outcome, you're free to risk big, necessary things. Your job isn't to guarantee success. Your job is to be obedient.
That's huge. What's second?
Second, it frees you from the fear of people. If your identity is anchored in God's unwavering view of you, then public opinion, applause, criticism, it all starts to lose its grip. You can make unpopular but principled decisions without agonizing over the fallout.
And the third one, which I think is pervasive.
The pervasive need for control. If you truly believe God is directing the path, you can stop trying to manipulate every detail. You can trust the process, trust your people, and trust the divine guidance we talked about.
And the result of clinging to all that control is anxiety. It's the signature condition of the unsupported leader. So what takes its place when a leader finally lets go of that?
Rest. Leading from a place of rest, not anxiety, is the ultimate sign of a stable leader. When you're rested, spiritually, mentally, physically, you bring this non-anxious presence into the room that actually calms the turbulent environment around you.
And your team feels that.
Your team absolutely feels that. They see your confidence isn't rooted in the perfection of the plan, but in the power of the one who's guiding the plan.
Which, I imagine, leads naturally to servant leadership, humility service leading from the bottom up.
It's the natural outgrowth of a surrendered heart. If you've been self-emptied, that kenosis, you have the capacity for humility. Humility allows you to serve. Serving builds trust. And trust is the real currency of influence and authority.
Hey.
Jesus' redefinition in Matthew, that greatness comes not from what we clutch, but from what we release. It shows that sustainable influence only flows where self-rule has died.
Okay, this is so essential for the listener trying to apply this today. Let's get really practical.
Yeah.
The actionable habits. This is where it gets real. What are the first 3 things someone needs to build into their routine?
Okay, the first habit has to be cultivating daily surrender prayers. And this isn't just a general morning devotion. It's a specific verbal act of transference, a simple offering.
Like what would you say?
Something like, Lord, I yield my plans, my influence, and my leadership to you today. Lead me. This daily act, it just preemptively stops the ego from re-seizing control as the day gets crazy. It reinforces that first step. Surrender leads to guidance.
Okay, so that's the internal alignment. What's the next step, the outward action?
The next step is practicing delegation without fear. A lot of leaders delegate tasks, but they don't actually delegate ownership or the outcome. That's just micromanagement rooted in their own insecurity.
Yeah.
For the surrendered leader, delegation becomes an act of obedience. You're trusting God's provision through your team. You resist that impulse to prove you're indispensable. This is how you move from guidance to influence, by empowering others instead of hoarding authority.
And the final piece involves creating space in your life, which is so hard in our high-demand world.
So hard, but so necessary. The last habit is creating intentional Sabbath and margin. Creating that margin actually reteaches you dependence. The leader who fills every single moment, who never stops to be still, is subconsciously believing the whole system will fall apart without their constant intervention.
Right.
Margin actively prevents that impulse to clutch control. It forces you to acknowledge that the world operates perfectly fine without your frantic input for a few hours or a whole day. It's an active exercise in trusting God's sovereignty over your calendar.
That reframes rest not as a luxury, but as a mandatory part of being spiritually competent.
Exactly. It makes rest part of the job description.
Hmm.
So, to just synthesize everything we've covered, the paradox holds true. Surrender really is the birthplace of clarity, of that non-anxious courage, of true authority, and of lasting transformation. The only leadership God can truly trust and profoundly use begins when we finally let go of our own self-sufficiency.
Okay, let's reflect on that as a final thought. We've seen that whether you're facing a Red Sea or running from a blinding light on the road, or fighting a generational evil, God's authority is the true source of strength. So if you are serious about pursuing impactful, sustainable leadership, ask yourself this final provocative question.
Mm-hmm.
Are your current leadership habits creating dependence on you and your own limited capacity, or are they actively creating dependence on God? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the paradox of surrendered authority.